You are listening to the Slow Living Podcast, and I'm your host, Stephanie O'Day. What if I told you that you could truly have the life of your dreams, the life you've always wanted, one filled with abundance, joy, and a sense of purpose? It's absolutely possible, and I see it each and every day with my coaching clients. It all starts with learning how to slow down. You deserve to live the life you've always dreamt about. Let's get started. So if you're a fan of the podcast, you're going to absolutely love the book. Slow Living, Cultivating a Life of Purpose in a Hustle-Driven World is now available wherever books are sold. Buy it for yourself, your children, your friends, and your neighbors. You can get all the juicy details at stephanieoday.com/slow living book. Trust me, this is hands down the best $20 you'll ever spend. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to episode 159 of the Slow Living Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie O'Day, and today we have a special guest who I'm excited to introduce to you all. Rachel Marie Martin is the author of Get Your Spark Back, which is her third book. You know her as the force behind the Finding Joy website, where she's been inspiring countless readers for years. Alongside her husband, Dan, Rachel is a lifelong entrepreneur, and together they live in Nashville with their blended family. That sounds an awful lot like the Brady Bunch. Rachel and I have a lot in common. We started our journeys in the early days of blogging. We've each had the experience of raising a child diagnosed with celiac disease long before it became widely understood. In fact, we even share a publisher, and I had the chance to dive into Get Your Spark Back shortly after it came out, just a month before my latest book. I loved reading it, and I know you will too. Rachel and I share so many of the same themes and values, especially when it comes to living with purpose and intention. Today, Rachel is here to share her slow living story with us, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So welcome, Rachel.
I'm super excited to be here. I'll tell you, I got teary when you said the thing about celiac, because to meet another celiac mom, it just instantly brings tears to my eyes of empathy, compassion, and then like somebody else gets my story.
Yeah. So my middle daughter, she was diagnosed in 2006. And as we all know, now it's common vernacular, but it was not at the time.
You had no bread in 2006. I mean, I had stuff that was so heavy it could hold the door open, but you had nothing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, that's actually how the Crockpot site got started, is I had to quit working to take care of her because I thought it was daycare germs. So her reaction is sporadic vomiting. What was your son's reaction?
He just fades away, becomes unbelievably lethargic. And when he was diagnosed, he was a baby, he was a toddler yet. He couldn't even stand up. He'd fall immediately over. So he was chronically ill all the time.
Poor baby boy. Yeah. It's really interesting. And it, I think, ties into one, getting your spark back, and then two, slow living. When you have a child with any sort of allergy or any sort of quote unquote atypicalness, you immediately have to stop and kind of reprioritize and decide on purpose what the next steps are, because you can't just blindly follow the pack. You get to decide what the next step is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like I think of it as like a stake in the ground. There was before he was diagnosed with celiac and after. And after, I tell moms all the time, there's never a day where I don't think about gluten. It's every single day. There's something where I'm looking at a label, thinking about that. And there before, it never crossed my mind. Maybe a little bit as he was getting close to diagnosis. But the after, it's trying to figure out, how do you make sense of the before and how do you go forward, making the after just as good.
Yeah. So my kid with celiac. So she's a sophomore in college. She turns 20 in a few weeks. How old is yours?
He'll be he's 15 now.
Okay.
And he's an advocate. Yeah.
So if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, so how do they get through high school? How do they get through college? They do. It's not a prob. You've always got a frozen pizza in the freezer.
Frozen cupcakes.
Yeah, ready to go. Thank God for Trader Joe's.
Oh, yes. I remember writing that when the regular pizza companies like DiGiorno or Freshetta come out with a gluten-free pizza, that the world has shifted. And now I can go into Kroger and do almost all my shopping there and know that he'll be fine. And I'm so grateful for that, because 20 years ago, again, that would have been a different life story.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. See, we have so much in common.
We
So
do.
so it's really interesting. I wanted to read from the introduction of your book, if you're
Okay.
okay with it, because it ties so nicely into slow living. And I think a lot of times people think that slow living or deciding on purpose to live your life with intention means you're like sitting around the house like kumbayaing and you're like Mary Poppinsing all the
Right.
time. And yeah, and that's not real life. So your book is about getting your spark back. And sometimes we talk about like the midlife crisis and what does that look like and what does that feel like. And so early in your book, you wrote, around 5 years ago, I realized that although I had come through many challenges, divorce, moving, single parenting, financial hardship, and creating a blended family, part of me still felt hollow, uninspired, and uncertain. In the hustle of solving problems, I had avoided addressing an internal ache. Then, one day, in the middle of regular life, with not perfect timing either, I began to wonder who I was now. I knew who I had been, but now I wasn't so sure. And not being sure made me incredibly uncomfortable. In those days, I would hear a very shaky, I don't know who I am anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Even that's another goosebump moment. And that shakiness, I've said for a long time, it was like I could look in the mirror and I knew the reflection coming back. I knew, oh, getting older, I knew all that, but boy, I didn't know my own self anymore. I knew the me that had existed prior, the fighter me, the one that had gotten through all that stuff, but the me going forward, trying to, categorize and figure it out. And I would say that when you hit midlife, that pressure of time changes. There's that definite shift of time where I'm going to be 50 in February of this year. And if I'm lucky, that's half my life. But my grandparents, they lived to 88, 85. And so I know I'm on the other side of it. And I just all of a sudden had that realization, I don't want to wait anymore. I am so tired of putting myself on hold.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I like the kind of deadline feeling. Sometimes though, the idea of being behind or where we are
Right.
isn't good enough actually kind of creates this feeling of procrastination and like analysis paralysis where instead of using a deadline to spring into action, we actually kind of like go within and curl up in the fetal position.
Right, right, right. Which I do talk about too, because I suffer from I call it decision paralysis too. But that pressure of time, it was like the realization of I could spend the rest of my life curled up in that fetal position. And I just didn't, that was so powerful of a motivator that I was like, okay, figure out how to uncurl. And I really believe the reason we get stuck is we think, figure out how to run as fast as we can versus figure out how to start uncoiling and moving forward.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You talk about embracing time wasters and not thinking that like daydreaming or goofing off is a waste of time. So can you speak a little bit to that?
I would love to, because so my big thing is the idea of wondering again. I have many little kids, and little kids wonder and wonder about everything. They wonder, why is the sky so blue? I wonder if I could do that. And then as we get older, I say we drop into a linear way of thinking, very, very linear. Go to school, fix this. Even our art in grade school is graded. Art, like the most subjective thing that, and we just learn, okay, I've got to fit into this box. And what happens is the time wasters we start to think of as foolish, or like a teacher would say, stop daydreaming. And for me, as a creative soul, daydreaming is what taps into the creativity. And I was told that it was a waste of time. And I know there's so many other people that are like that. And I just wanted to give permission to allow yourself to even step your toe back into that, wondering, what could I do? Or wondering about possibilities again versus needing to have everything figured out before we start. Because again, if we have to have every step figured out, there's the perfectionism. And I am a procrastinating or a perfectionism that deals with procrastination that I'm coupled together, which is lethal. So I have just had to learn in my own unraveling how to stop procrastinating. And it goes back to how to stop being a perfectionist.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all probably seen that internet meme where it's someone standing at the bottom of a staircase wondering how to get to the top. And legit, the
Right.
only way to get to the top is to take that first teeny tiny baby step. And then it's interesting because we're both authors. It's really daunting when you
Right.
now have a deadline for a huge book and you have to meet 40 or 50,000 words. Um,
Right.
it's not fun.
No,
It's
no,
not fun.
no. I know. There's a part I share in the book about my family probably all groans when they know I've got a book to do because I do not feel like I am happy or content or feel like I have direction until I'm about 80% done with that book. And maybe even farther because the beginning, it's a grind and it's so much sinking into the unknown and trusting the process. Because if I try to make it super fixed, it won't work. And I mean, I remember being in college and they would say, okay, listen, I need you to write out all the steps for this book. And it'd be a month or an article I'd have to write. Do the outline, do this. And then I get it back and they'd be like, B. And then I would do, which I know I would get that little bit of pressure of time in there because I'm a procrastinator. And I would crank it out in 2 days and then I'd get super well thought out A. So I had to, as a writer, I have to recognize, okay, sometimes that pressure helps me just get it out. When there's too much nebulous time, I'm in that space of like, oh, it could be this. And then I start to self doubt.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's that flow state and figuring out
Yeah.
how you personally can access that flow state. And it's different for everybody. And that's what's so tricky when it comes to schooling and how
Right.
like kind of society is laid out. If you follow these steps exactly in this way, you too will get an A. Eh, and in real life, there's ups and downs and all arounds. And I know you write to that and so well. And one of my favorite quotes in your book that I've highlighted is you write, "You are never wasting time when you begin to pay attention to the whispers of your soul."
Thank you. I really, that quote was really neat. One of the editors said, I knew it was, like after you write it, you're like, did I really write that? Like, where did that come from? And one of the editors was like, do we need attribution? And I was like, wait, I wrote that. I
You
wrote
did write
that.
that. Yeah.
But
It was not
I
Chat
love it.
GPT. That was you.
Yeah, that was me. I love that because when you hustle too fast or you're just on that train that's moving so fast and quickly, you crowd out your own soul's whispers and your soul isn't screaming at you. That part of you that tells you what you love to do, it's like a whisper, and in order to get there, you have to be willing to slow down, to stop the chatter, or like for me, I have to actually experience all the chatter and get through it all to get to the other side, and then I can hear my soul.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. We talk about that a lot on this podcast and in the new slow living book, which
Mhm.
I know. So we share the same publisher. So Rachel is
Right.
waiting for my book to arrive to her. But I'm really glad that I didn't read your book until I fully wrote mine because I would have thought, well, there's no way they're going to do this because it's as if
Right.
sometimes we're sharing the same thoughts. But I think a lot of it has to do with we're of similar age and stage in life. And
Right.
we've been writing online
Right.
for such a long time. And we know
OG.
well, it's interesting because when you write online for so long, you're so quick to be able to sniff out the BS and what's
Yes.
fake and what's phony. And both of us believe in living in a transparent, authentic way and not like glossing it over for the
Mhm.
internet. So you have a quote in a Facebook post that went viral. It's been shared over 30 million times. And you wrote, "Sometimes you have to let go of the picture of what you thought life would be and learn to find joy in the story you're actually living."
Yeah. Yeah. That quote is so, it's very humbling to me. Again, it goes back to that when you are in sync with your soul and you're in that flow spot, the stuff that you write or if you can just capture that, there's some rawness in it. It's a human connection. And that quote I had written on the very night where, so you kind of mentioned it in my bio. I went through a really hard divorce over a decade ago, got myself untethered from an unhealthy marriage. But when you live a public private life, people assumed everything was good to go. And then all of a sudden they saw me. And that was the first time people thought, well, she's in a midlife crisis, not realizing I was actually getting my life back together. And when you go through divorce, the kids, they're in this really weird spot, and the relationships, they have to go through the process too. And what ended up happening was my oldest son and we went through a really, really tough time, and he ended up deciding to not stay with me. I live in Nashville. My ex-husband lives in the Minneapolis area, and he decided he wasn't going to come back. And I was devastated. I was just, I mean, devastated at the time. You just think back to all those times rocking him and all of that. And how is this my story? And I was right outside on my front porch, and I wrote that, and I just knew, because I could hear my other kids inside, that I had to figure out how to live this life going forward with a story that didn't match what I wanted. I mean, nobody writes in their yearbook, it'll be really fun is when I'm 40, I'm going to go through divorce. That'll be a great goal. Yet we all have those stories. And to couple with your point about that, the internet, I really wanted to be a truth teller. Is when I first wrote that, it was around the time when my first book came out. And about 3 months after that, I was on the Today Show. And my agent said, "Hey, Rachel, can you get a picture by the sign? It says like today is." And it said today is November 9th. And I just had this just gut-wrenching moment because that was my son's birthday. And so here I was at the high and the low. And I shared the post, shared the picture, and a couple days later wrote to my audience about the truth behind that picture and the truth behind those words, and that sometimes what you see on the internet isn't the full story. And I wanted that part to come through. Like, I can see looking at it that there's both in my eyes, the excitement and the sorrow at the same moment.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So we have lots of different people with different walks of life who listen to this podcast, and some of them are actively in the thick of it right now. They've
Right.
got toddlers, preschoolers, grade schoolers in the house. We're heading into the holiday season. So they are really wanting to capture those
Right.
perfect family pictures and the perfect memories, and this is perfect and that is perfect and look at how shiny and happy we are. So what
Right.
advice would you give to them?
Well, first of all, just to try to embrace the moment as much as you can. It's really hard looking back. I can see my own younger self. I've watched videos and I'm like, oh, Rachel, I wish you would just have slowed down a little bit. But the Rachel back then was doing the best she knew. And so I've learned all that grace. So first, give yourself grace. And, know that for your kids, it's so often the little things that really matter the most. My oldest has written a Mother's Day thing to me once, and in it said that she was so grateful for the time we got to play cards at the lake. I mean, playing cards. And I look at my family, and there's a card game that we've been playing generations, and all my kids know how to play it, and we all play it, and that is the glue. It's not all the other stuff. It's this very intimate, small $3.99 a pack card thing that we play, and to really just embrace those moments. And you know what? It might even be, you might even get through, not even get the picture, or it'll be a crazy picture. And that's the picture that you're going to end up loving. The ones that are
Yeah.
impromptu.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I live in Silicon Valley area, so
Hmm.
it's a lot of keeping up with the Joneses, and
Right.
the white Tesla is not good enough, so now I need the blue Tesla and that kind of thing. So when it comes to that, and especially since you have so many children that you're
Right.
trying to raise to be balanced, capable future adults, how do you kind of reconcile if they want some of these kind of like trappings of success or like markers of quote unquote a life well lived, when you actually know deep down inside a life well lived is sitting at the lake playing cards?
Right. When you're in that environment, that's what you know. So I always give grace to the kids. If they're in that environment, they're being they're with other people. So it's kind of easy to judge and go, well, you shouldn't just be like that. But that's the nature of it. For me, and my husband Dan, one of the things that we really want to introduce our kids to is that the center of the world and the universe isn't, because we live in Nashville, isn't Nashville. So we try to expose them as much as we can to seeing the world from a different perspective. And we do that through travel, through just expanding that view of what it is and what can be. And then for me with my kids, because there are so many, half my kids remember when I was in deep financial issues. So they have this different money relationship that they have to work with, where they have to deal with this fear of money, where this worrying, or, oh, mom, that's too much. And the other half have seen me on the side where I fixed it, where they're like, hey, can we just go get that quick little waffle at the coffee place? Whereas 20 years ago, I would have been like, absolutely, there's no way. And so it's kind of this balancing of understanding their money story and then trying to help them navigate within that money story and then figure out ways, okay, how can you give back, or what's truly important, or maybe too, like, what brings you joy and happiness. It's easy for us to say, well, that shouldn't bring you joy and happiness, but allowing somebody to actually figure it out too.
Do you have any resources or have you done some writing on kind of teaching financial responsibility to children?
Not to children. I've talked a lot about money, which I think the universe and God is very funny about, because if you would have talked to me 20 years ago, the thing I would have been most afraid about was talking about my finances because I had so much shame, so much shame. And when you live under shame, you don't accomplish anything because shame keeps you in that fetal position of you can't do anything. And what ended up happening is one of the things I'm the most proud about is speaking about financial literacy for women. And that Today Show episode that I was talking about, I ended up talking about women and finances. And this segment was a thing exposing my life before and what I've
Mm.
done. But what's so amazing about it is that led to me speaking for the state of Arkansas about finances and to women about financial health and healing, which led me to speaking to the state treasurers to their annual meetup. And here I am in a room, and there's like the state treasurer from Kentucky and Illinois and Indiana, all of them in there. And I got to share my heart. But the part that made me the most humbled and grateful was I got to be on a panel talking about actual reform. And I thought, okay, when you keep silent, nothing changes. And the thing I was the most afraid about became the thing that became part of my platform.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So now that you've got older kids who are
Mm-hmm.
starting to like navigate through the college system
Yes.
and that kind of stuff, what advice do you give them when they're trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up?
Well, it's interesting because I have one home right now that's a freshman in college. And first of all, I don't press you have to go to college because I'm an entrepreneur. I mean, I went to college, I have college debt, and or I did, and I don't even I never got my degree, which was another place that I was too afraid to talk about for so long. But I got all the way, did 5 years, and was like 22 credits short. But so I tell them that. I tell them, don't feel the pressure to do that, but don't sit around doing nothing. And so my daughter Grace, she knew she didn't want to go to college, but she didn't know what she wanted to do. So I said, well, let's just take a year, figure it out. And so she worked full time at Starbucks, got many offers to move up within it. And then in 2020, she said, I'm going to join the military. And I was like, what? What? This is my 103-pound daughter that's 5'3". I was like, are you kidding me? And she said, yeah, I'm gonna. And so my husband's dad was 20 years retired Air Force, and he was like, all right. And we got in the car and we drove to the recruiter's office. And I thought for sure that that would be the end. Like no, she's gonna listen and not. And no, she signed up, and now she's been serving. She's part of the US Space Force, and has been doing that for the last 4 years or so. Or yeah. And I'm so grateful, but I believe that if I had pressured her into making a decision when she was right out of high school, that's not the path she would have been on. And so I think it's like it's the tension of both. It's the tension of You need to try to do something, but don't feel like what everybody tells you you have to do is the right thing, but don't just sit around.
Yeah. No, I like the idea of kind of playing the trajectory forward. Okay.
Right.
So where do you see yourself at 35, 45?
Right.
Okay. Well, what kind of house do you want to live in? Okay, great. Well, what does that cost? Oh, okay.
Right.
What kind of professions will provide that for you, and working
Right.
backwards of that? Not necessarily getting into a name brand college with a name brand degree. It truly is legit just a piece of paper if you don't apply that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that allowing them to feel the real implications of money is
Hmm.
important. So my son that's home right now, one of the first things he said when he came back was he appreciated how we try to just the grocery cost of like making sure the cheese is shut. Or he goes, Mom, I know you guys always got after me about the not like wasting creamer, but he goes,
Mm.
now I get it. Now I get it. We use like we go through 2 bottles. I'm like, I know. And so I think having those moments where there's that part of ownership where they have to try to take ownership and they experience the real tension of money, it's helpful because now there becomes a value added to stuff. When they're at home, sometimes there's not that much. That's just, wow, they're just complaining. I left the cheese open. Whereas I'm like, dude, that was like $4 right there.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. And if you're listening to this and you think it doesn't apply because you have tiny little kids in the house, it does apply, because if
It
they
does.
break a toy, don't go out and replace the toy. The natural consequence for a broken toy that you were neglectful for is you don't have the toy.
Right.
So don't be the swooper innerer. It's okay for kids to work through uncomfortable emotions and
Yes.
issues and challenges, and persevere, and maybe they do some extra chores and figure out how to replace the toy, or something. But I think sometimes it's really easy in this kind of like buy now society, and how we're living in this kind of fast-paced culture right now, to just quickly replace and not allow children to be creative with trying to solve the problem. And they're just like, no, do this for me. At school, I'm a school site secretary. It drives me nuts when I'll have somebody hand me a string cheese wrapper to open, like, open this. I'm like, first off, hi, Mrs. O'Day, will you please help me open this string cheese? And then second, have you even tried to open it
Right.
yourself? Like, sometimes string cheese is tricky, but you should
True.
at least try.
True. You sound like my husband Dan. He'd be like, "All right, if you were stranded on a desert island, I am sure you could get that string cheese open. It's just going to take a little bit, but I'm sure you can."
Yeah.
I really love what you're saying because I remember when I was in school, my kids got my grades. My parents got my grades maybe mid-quarter and then quarter, and only otherwise if there was a problem. Well, now I can go onto the computer and I can see the kids' grades all the time, and my kids can see their grades all the time, and it creates this like pressure on them. And as a parent, I've had to learn to say, okay, I see that there's 3 things late, and not say something to them right away because otherwise, like if I had late things when I was growing up, it was on me to fix it so that I would have the good report. If I'm always hounding them, then they're not ever learning that, okay, I have to figure this out. Like my kids know they get I forgot my lunch once a semester. Now that they're in high school, like once a year. Now, my celiac son, his is a little trickier, but still, I'm like, dude, you could probably figure out there's something in that cafeteria that you could eat. And so it's taught them the responsibility. Otherwise, I can't, I don't have the time to drive a lunchbox there for
No, it's
them.
true. And
Mm.
and it's funny if you're wondering, well, what could they eat in a school cafeteria? It's the things ending with Eatos, Cheetos,
Right.
Doritos, Fritos. They're all there. They're all there all the time.
They're there. And I see them on the tab. Like I'll see low lunch balance. And I'm like, what did they eat? And then I'm like, what? What is that?
Okay. So I want to, one, pivot it back to your book, but two, I know we could talk forever
We
because
could.
you're super funsies. But this comes up a lot with my one-on-one coaching clients, and it's a theme that really happens often in midlife, where women feel alone. and they
Hmm.
feel isolated. And if you are trying to get your spark back and you're realizing, what do I do that's for me? Do I like even have any friends? You write about that quite a bit in your book.
Yeah, I do. Well, first of all, if you're the one thinking that's me, like you're not alone. I try to tell that to women all the time. You're not alone because aloneness is like shame. When you feel alone, you think, I can't expose myself because I'm feeling alone because we see a world that seems like it's put together. Go on Instagram, put together, go on Facebook, TikTok, put together. And then the people that aren't put together, we're like, is that even real? So we live in this kind of skeptic world, but if you're feeling like you're alone, you're not alone. And again, the baby step is really when you have that wondering, that's the most vulnerable spot you can be in because it's really that's your soul's whisper saying, "Oh my goodness, you are so important. I want you to find you again. I want you to figure it out." And maybe you don't know what you like, and that's okay. You it's not about okay, I'll start when I figure out what I like again. It's maybe I'll just start to figure out what I like again. It's changing it from starting when I got all the answers to, I don't know. I'm just going to try this. I'm going to try this. And if it doesn't work, I don't have to stay in it. I can figure out something else to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, an actual practical step if someone is feeling alone and decides, okay, this is it. We're coming up in the new year. I'm going to reinvent
Right.
myself. How do I go find friends?
You have to put yourself in a spot to find friends. That is the number one thing. You can't find friends sitting at home on the couch. You have to actually put yourself in a spot, and then you have to allow the percolation of friends to take time. It takes time. It's not an immediate thing. I tell a story about my friend Catherine. We met in a meditation class, and it was a year of us sitting in a circle, probably even longer, before one of us said, "Hey, do you want to meet for coffee?" But it really does take somebody stepping out of what's safe and saying to another person, "Do you want to meet for coffee?" And then being okay with the answer, yes or no. And the no might not even have something to do with you, but until you are vulnerable and put yourself in a spot where there are other like minded people, then it's very hard to meet friends.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we grew up watching Friends and
Yes.
Seinfeld and The Big Bang
Yes.
Theory and thought like, oh, everybody has an apartment full of friends all the time. And when you're young, it's super easy. And
Right.
also when your kids are in school and you're doing play dates, it's much easier to make friends because it's just easier for the kids to have play dates. And all of a sudden you have so much in common with this
Right.
other group of people. But when the kids grow, and their likes change and their sport changes, and then you actually think, do I even really like these grown-ups, or is
Right.
the only thing we have in common the kids? Because I
Right.
actually don't actually like the way they're parenting teenagers and kind of don't want my
Right.
kids around their kids anymore. It turns tricky.
It does. It's super, super tricky because you're right. When they're young, it's kind of it's a little bit easier in the way that it's almost safer. It's small. The stakes are smaller. But as they get older, especially with teenagers, it's uncomfortable. Or like you were saying, you might be the only thing we talk about is basketball. I don't really have anything in common besides that. We talk about the tournaments and all of that. And that's the part where I feel like we get lost is okay, who am I outside of the sphere of my children? And what do I like to do? Or what interests me? Or what did I used to like to do? And then trying to put yourself in an environment where there's like-minded people or a bunch of beginners. That's my favorite part is daring to be a beginner, which I believe is a very challenging spot because nobody likes to be the beginner. Nobody likes to be the person in the class that's like, what? Could you show me how to do that again? But you know it, I know it, especially because we've been on the internet for so long. You and I wouldn't have gotten to this spot unless we one day were a beginner and type that very first post and hit submit. And in
Yeah.
order to get to the spot where you can talk to somebody else, you have to be willing to go, I'm going to do this and I don't know what's going to happen from it, but I'm just going to try.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also want to point out that while the internet is wonderful for
Mm-hmm.
meeting people, like minded people, it's different through the computer than it is face to face. And at some point you do have to climb out of the computer and go meet people face to face.
You do. You do. I mean, I would agree. I've met some of my wonderful friends I have met online, but when you meet in real life, there's that cementing, that hug, that moment where you're like, okay, you're really real. And it changes everything. And some of my greatest friends have been blogging friends, internet friends that I met a decade, 15 years ago, and we're still friends. But I really believe we're still friends because we made the commitment to meet each other at a certain point.
Yeah. Thank you. Rachel, how can people find you and how can we buy your book and give it to all of our friends?
Okay, well, most people find me on my blog, findingjoy.net, or on Facebook, it's Finding Joy Blog. And if you type it in, you'll see my face pop up and a little blue check mark because Meta decided I was real. So that's nice. And then my book is sold wherever books are sold, Amazon, Books a Million, Barnes and Noble, and your independent bookstore.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Slow Down Society. I really appreciate you being here and taking the time to listen and learn. This absolutely counts as self care. So give yourself a hug. You're doing a great job. I'll see you again next week. Do you have a slow living story to share? Leave me a voicemail at stephanieoday.com/podcast with any questions, comments, feedback, or testimonials, and I will be sure to include it in an upcoming episode. Also, if you found value in this episode, please share it with your family and friends and subscribe through your favorite podcast provider. The more you share, comment, and leave positive reviews, the more people we can reach and share the slow living lifestyle and messaging. Thank you, Slow Down Society, and have an absolutely wonderful day.